Who else is? But I know what you're thinking. You're listening this morning thinking this is all very well, Peachy, but what's happened to Louise Hulland? Morning, Louise.
Good morning. That was a great track, by the way. I was enjoying that very much.
I knew that'd be right up your street. So, I mean, we've been inundated most days since you last appeared on this show and on the Peach Quest with people saying, "Where's Louise Hulland? Here's Louise Hulland." There's all sorts been going on in Louise's life. So tell me a bit more about what you've been working on, because as well as doing things like presenting on Radio Berkshire, you're also doing some investigative journalism into a subject that really, really is close to your heart.
Yeah, it is. I released a book this week, which was completely terrifying and inspiring at the same time. Because obviously, I don't know about you, Peachy, but you know, when you really sort of get behind something, you put your passion into it, then you put it out into the world. It's quite a scary thing. But I've been looking into human trafficking and modern slavery around the UK for the last few years, and I published a book on it this week. And yeah, it's been quite an eye-opening experience because we really do have sort of modern slavery all around us, and it's kind of crazy to think that in Britain in 2020, but sadly it is a problem, and it's a problem that's getting worse.
People might have seen you talking about this on the One Show, among many other places. What is modern slavery? Just define what you mean for us.
So if you think about slavery in history books, we think about shackles, don't we? Shackles and chains and people being bought and sold at markets. And of course, that does happen still in other parts of the world. But what we're talking about modern slavery in the UK is people having their liberty taken away, being controlled by traffickers and gangmasters who kind of break them down emotionally. So while there may not be physical chains that we sort of associate with slavery, these people are controlled through coercive control mechanisms that make them absolutely at the behest of the trafficker. So, for example, perhaps they've been brought to this country thinking they were coming here for a better life. And when they got here, the papers were taken away and they were made to work off a debt. And the traffickers are potentially threatening the lives of their family back at home. So people sort of stay under their control because they don't want any harm to come to their family. But the biggest group of people that weren't there's a system called the National Referral Mechanism, and when people are rescued from slavery, they have the choice to be identified by that system, and that's how they get their support. And the biggest group of people for the last 2 years that went into that system were British. So actually, for 2 years in a row, it's been British people who've been the biggest victims of modern slavery in the UK.
That's interesting because we imagine it to be people who've just arrived in the country and therefore don't have a network of support around them. You know, they may not have all the official paperwork that you need and whatever. But it's not only that sort of story, it's also people born and raised in Britain who are ending up in this situation. Doing so how?
Well, for example, modern slavery is kind of like an umbrella term, and underneath the umbrella term, we see things like sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, and enforced labour. So, for example, with the criminal exploitation, you'll have heard of county lines, Andrew. It's something that's been going on, or certainly been in the press quite a lot the last few years. And when I was growing up, if you were a young person dealing drugs and going sort of around the UK dealing drugs, you'd have been a drug dealer. But now we're much better at realising when someone is a victim of another criminal. So, for example, with these drugs gangs, what we're seeing now is actually young people that are being targeted by them. They're vulnerable. They don't necessarily have a great family network. They've got some kind of vulnerability that means the drug gangs are targeting them to send them off on their drug deals to ensure that the gangs themselves stay out of trouble. And it's the young person who's vulnerable that's putting themselves in the firing line. So that's one area. The other area is that traffickers also tend to target people who are rough sleepers or have addiction problems so that they're easy to control, and the assumption is that not many people will miss them. So the traffickers are very clever, and I use that word not in a positive way, at finding people who have got these extreme vulnerabilities, people that won't necessarily be missed, or people that can be targeted in some way because there may be potentially going to have something that the trafficker can hold over them, whether it's the fact that they've come here via the trafficker because they think that they've come for a genuine job opportunity and their papers will be waiting for them just to find. So there was a story that's in the book that I covered last year, and it was the biggest modern slavery case in the UK, where there were over 300 victims. And what would happen was this gang in Poland would wait outside prisons and target men that had come out of prison wanting a fresh start, no family connections, needing work, and they'd tempt them over to the Midlands with a promise of a work, but then they were all living many people to a house. I think they had a handful of houses around the West Midlands, and they would work these people to the bone, but they weren't getting paid. And the reason that this story got exposed was because these men kept using local food banks and soup kitchens, which were run by a charity. And the charity realised, hang on a minute, all these men are working. How are they so poverty stricken coming in here and needing food and shelter all the time? And it's because they were all victims of this gang that were earning millions of pounds and driving around in Bentleys, and yet these people were earning nothing.
And how can people spot it? Because one thing that's really frightening about what you're telling us is that this is going on undoubtedly right now today in Slough, in Bracknell, in Reading, under our noses. It's not some kind of like far-fetched storyline from Line of Duty. This is something that's happening here. How can we know and do something about it?
Well, as an aside, one of the biggest cases, one of the earliest, most famous cases actually happened in Reading and Slough. It was a gang that was trafficking those areas, and a young girl was brought over here, trafficked by her uncle and aunt, and she was made to sell the Big Issue. And she was only 13 years old, and she wasn't getting any of that money. And they've also done a big operation called Operation Golf almost 10 years ago. That was in this area. And that's terrifying to think that when they were raiding local houses in Slough, that they were finding people, babies sleeping in a sink, families crammed in rooms, loads of families in one house, and then you open the fridge, there was nothing in it. So actually, one of the most shocking cases was in that region, and it's such a lovely area, isn't it, Berkshire? You sort of think this is where lovely, nice, kind people live, and one of these most horrendous cases was there. So I think I think it's really important to know that whilst it is everywhere and it's under our nose, you don't necessarily have to find it everywhere. The responsibility is to keep your eyes open, but not necessarily to be correct about it. There's going to be no comeback on you if you have a suspicion, and then the authorities will be the people that check it out. So you can't really. The worst case scenario is that you were wrong and no harm will have been done. If you're right, you could have given someone their freedom. But what we're talking about in terms of spotting the situation is kind of the body language and the demeanour of the people that maybe you bump into at the car wash or the nail bar, or your cleaner that cleans your office at night when you're working late. They won't necessarily work for your company if they're subcontracted by agencies and come through various different ways into that cleaning job. There's no guarantee that they're actually getting their wages. Traffickers are very clever like this. So really the fundamental thing comes down to how willing they are to be able to engage with you and interact and chat. So the word that's often used is how cowed people feel, how reticent they are to talk to you, how they won't answer questions, how they'll maybe look like they're living in fear. They might look not very well turned out. They might not look very healthy because they're being starved. There will be a sense of fear and unkemptness about them. And if you are going to get your car washed in one of these really cheap pop-up car washes, bear in mind, think of the logistics of the money. If you're paying £6 and 8 men are washing your car to get it done in 5 minutes, think about how that works out per head in terms of the cost. Are they wearing the right equipment? There's been some horrendous stories I've seen where men who've been rescued from car washes it's very early in the morning, so I won't be too graphic, but when they've finally been able to get them out of the clothes, the chemicals have basically attached their clothes to their skin, and it's been a very, very painful experience for them. So if it's the middle of winter and they're wearing flip-flops using harsh chemicals, that's a sign of certain exploitation. Okay. And also, are there mattresses there? Are people sleeping on the premises because they've got no home to go to?
Louise, it's really interesting, your book, Stolen Lives it's called, and I'd encourage people to go and seek it out and have a look at it. And it's very good to catch up with you on the programme this morning. Look after yourself.
You too. Thanks, Peachy.
Thank you very much indeed. Dominic, one of the many listeners, have been in touch to say, Louise, great to hear. Thank you very much indeed for that. If you're interested on the radio, you'll find Louise doing The Breakfast Show on BBC Radio Cambridgeshire at the moment. It's 9 o'clock now.